Okay, so this author we're diving into today, he starts off with a pretty wild admission. Like, get this. He thinks he's worth somewhere between 400 million and 900 million dollars.
Whoa.
Yeah, right. It's a pretty huge gap for someone who's supposed to be, rich. Makes you wonder what rich even means?
Yeah, totally. It's like, is that a rounding error or just a very relaxed attitude towards money when you have that much?
Exactly. And this is Felix Dennis, by the way, the author of How to Get Rich. And the book's style is kind of like that admission. Straightforward, no nonsense. It's like he's just sitting across from you telling it like it is.
Yeah, no sugarcoating. Right. You shared this book because you wanted that kind of real talk about making serious money, not some get-rich-quick scheme or motivational fluff.
Exactly. I mean, I'm not expecting a magic formula, but I'm definitely interested in those unexpected insights, the kind of stuff you don't get from those typical success stories. Like what are the pitfalls people fall into, or the things that change about you when you actually hit it big?
Right, the kind of stuff only someone who's been there can tell you. And Dennis definitely doesn't hold back, which I think is what makes this book so interesting. And that's what we're going to dig into today, the mindset, the challenges, even the downsides that come with big-time wealth.
Totally. And for you listening in, think of this as a deep dive, not just a summary. We're pulling out the juiciest bits, those aha moments that make you think differently about the whole idea of getting rich.
Right. Like, Dennis doesn't even define rich in a straight-up way. He talks about having multiple houses, a bunch of cars, owning land, but then he says rent anything that flies, floats, or fornicates. That's classic Dennis right there.
Oh, yeah, definitely memorable advice. It's practical, but also kind of funny. But he also talks about something you can't really put your finger on, that confidence that seems to just ooze out of wealthy people no matter how they got their money.
Yeah. It's interesting. He contrasts it with how people from different backgrounds behave with money. Like, she talks about watching rich women haggle super hard at charity shops, something he says he rarely sees from working-class women, even if they need the discount more.
That makes you think about how wealth changes your relationship with money. Like, maybe it makes you hyper-aware of its value in a way.
Maybe, yeah. And then he tackles this whole idea of needing a brilliant, original idea to strike it rich. He even uses this funny example of a Spider-Man gun he thought up but never actually did anything with.
The Spider-Man gun, right? That's a good one.
Yeah, his point is, the idea is just the very beginning. It's the follow-through, the hard work, the execution that's what actually matters.
So it's not about having that lightning bolt of inspiration.
He says it's 1,000 times more important to just do the work.
Yeah.
So, for our listeners out there, yeah, ideas are great, but don't get stuck there. It's all about how you bring it to life.
It's about taking action. He also pushes back on this whole idea that it was somehow easier to get rich back in the day, like when he was starting out in the late 60s.
Right, like those good old days we always hear about. But he says human nature hasn't changed, and people always want wealth. The drive to get rich is still there.
It's a constant, huh?
Yeah, and he actually brings up the global economy as an example. Like, we hear so much about China and India rising, but he points out that the U.S. economy, even now, is still bigger than the next 5 biggest economies combined.
Really? I didn't realize it was still that dominant.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising. But his point is, there are still huge opportunities within that system, even with all the changes happening globally.
Okay, that makes sense. So then he gets into how we even measure wealth. And he's like, hold on, it's not as simple as it seems. He talked about cash in hand, the stuff you can quickly turn into money versus your total net worth, which includes all kinds of assets that are harder to put a price on.
Yeah, it gets complicated. Like, imagine owning a piece of a private company. You can't just cash that out easily. And then there are taxes and all that. So his point is, pinning down a precise number for your worth is actually way harder than you think.
Okay, so even rich people might not know exactly how much they're worth.
It's more nuanced than just looking at your bank balance, for sure. And then he throws in this curveball, like getting rich doesn't automatically make you happy. He even compares money to sex, like if you don't have it, it's all you can think about, but if you do, other things become more important.
It's an interesting analogy.
Yeah, he's saying money can actually bring its own set of problems.
Yeah.
And he even defines the lesser rich people with like 30 to 80 million in total assets.
Lesser rich. That's funny.
Right. But he's saying even at that level, there's a huge potential for being unhappy.
Oh, food for thought, right. And then to really hammer home the point, he has this whole availability on request thought experiment. Like, imagine having zero money, but anytime you need something, you can just snap your fingers and get it.
Ah, the magic genie of wealth.
Exactly. You'd be considered poor on paper, but in reality, you'd have access to anything you wanted.
It really makes you think about what wealth truly means. It's more about the freedom and possibilities than just the money itself.
Yeah, and to address those who might say, oh, it's easier for him to get rich, he's like, nope. He straight up says money doesn't care about your background, race, education, anything.
It's a bold statement, for sure.
Yeah, and it might be controversial to some, but I think he's trying to say your drive and your actions are what matters, not where you came from.
Right. It's like the system might not be fair, and there are definitely inequalities, but he's saying you can overcome those if you're focused enough.
It's about taking control. And speaking of action, he gives some really cool examples of when going against what everyone else thought actually paid off big time, like his poster magazine idea and how he was early to the whole personal computer thing with his publications.
It's a good lesson.
Yeah, like sometimes the biggest opportunities are the ones that other people dismiss. You gotta have the guts to see what they don't.
It takes courage.
Yeah. And he also talks about how being young can actually be a huge advantage. You know, that ambition, not being afraid to take risks, all that energy you have when you're starting out.
Yeah, he seems kind of wistful about his younger self, all that drive.
Yeah, he definitely has a bit of that youth is wasted on the young vibe. But he also gets that it's hard to just drop everything and go for it, especially when you have a mortgage, kids, all that.
Life gets in the way sometimes. He even quotes this philosopher, R.G. Collingwood, who said, you can't just live in the past or the future.
Right. Be present or something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
Although Collingwood was talking about history, not money. But Dennis's point is, you can't wait forever for the perfect time to take a chance.
It'll never come. It's got to jump in, right?
Okay. Exactly. And another interesting thing he brings up is that there are fewer people inheriting massive wealth these days, like those rich lists we see. More and more of those folks actually made their own money.
So it's more of a level playing field now.
Well, maybe not entirely level, but it's definitely shifting. More opportunities for people who aren't born into money.
And he throws out this crazy statistic. He thinks only a small percentage of people are actually actively trying to get rich.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah, so the competition might not be as fierce as we think.
If that's true, that's pretty encouraging.
Now, this is where he gets really honest and maybe a bit dark. He looks back on his own crazy pursuit of wealth and admits he has some regrets. Like, he wishes he'd focused on having enough sooner so he could have spent more time on other things he loved, like his poetry.
Yeah, he talks about the wild times, the parties, the excesses. And it's not all glamorous. He's pretty open about the downsides.
It's refreshing, actually. He's not pretending it's all sunshine and roses. He even compares making money to a drug. Like, it can be addictive and you have to know your limits.
That's a powerful analogy.
Yeah, and he talks about the Jeremiahs, those naysayers who try to bring you down when you have a new idea. And he really hates committees, calls them the death knell of any project.
Too much talk, not enough action, right?
Exactly. He's all about making decisions, moving forward, even if it's not perfect. Just say, let's do it, or let's forget it and move on.
Be decisive.
Yes. And he says you have to truly believe in yourself, more than just wanting to avoid failure. He says the fear of failing publicly is often bigger than the actual risk of losing money.
Oh, that's so true. It's like we worry more about what people will think than the actual consequences.
Yeah. And he even talks about how adults, without even realizing it, try to steer young people towards those safe, traditional careers. Like, he wanted to be an R&B singer when he was a kid.
Really? That's a far cry from magazine publishing.
Right. And it makes you wonder how many people end up in jobs they never really chose.
It's like that waiting for Godot play he mentions, where nothing really happens. You're just stuck waiting for something to change instead of making it happen.
Yeah, I've been there. He also tells this story about how he almost launched his own personal computer magazine but decided not to. Then later, he had the chance to buy Personal Computer World, but it ended up costing him a fortune to get full control.
It's like sometimes the opportunities come back around, but they might not be easy.
Yeah, life's funny like that. And one thing I thought was interesting, he warns against this whole team spirit thing at work. Like, yeah, it's good for morale, but when it comes to getting rich, it's not about everyone being equal.
He's saying there's a difference between working together and everyone getting a piece of the pie.
Yeah, the owners are the ones who ultimately benefit the most, even if everyone's working hard.
It's a realistic perspective, for sure.
So when it comes to finding those big opportunities, he says, look at new emerging industries, like where there's lots of risk capital flowing, where no one really knows what they're doing yet. That's where you can make a splash.
It's like the Wild West of business, right?
Yeah.
You can become an expert quickly because everyone's learning as they go.
Exactly. He says it's like riding a rising tide. Even if you're not the best surfer, you'll still get lifted up.
I like that analogy.
He also says it's not just about the industry, but the specific sector within it. Like, being a small fish in a growing pond is better than being a small fish in a shrinking pond.
Makes sense. But he also made good money in the printing industry, which everyone said was dying.
Right, so it's not a hard and fast rule.
Yeah, there are always exceptions. But it's about finding those niches where you can thrive, even in a so-called declining industry.
And then he gets into the whole game of getting funding. He basically says you got to figure out how to join and beat the system.
Join and beat, huh?
Yeah, like you got to play the game to get the money, but you also have to be smart about not giving away too much of your company.
Yeah, it's that balance of getting the resources you need without losing control.
And he's a big believer in doing what you're good at, not just what you're passionate about. He even tells this story about a super talented salesperson who dreamed of being a watercolor artist.
So, like, he was good at selling, but his heart wasn't really in it.
Yeah, and his point is, you got to be realistic. Passion's great, but if you can't actually make money from it, what's the point?
Yeah, got to pay the bill somehow.
Right. He says, figure out what you're actually good at and lean into that, even if it's not your dream job.
And how do you do that? Just try a bunch of things.
He says there's an element of blind faith and trial and error, which is kind of funny coming from a guy who's made millions.
Right. But his own story backs it up. He started out selling magazines on the street, and that led him to publishing.
So sometimes you got to just get out there and do stuff, see what sticks. And he keeps emphasizing, it's not just about the idea, it's about executing a plan.
Action, action, action.
Yes. And then there's luck, of course. He doesn't deny that it plays a role, but he says you have to be ready for it.
Like that saying, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity.
Exactly. He tells the story about his friend Tony Elliott, who came up with the idea for TV listings in Time Out magazine.
I remember that story.
Yeah, and Tony struggled for years to make it happen, but then others came along and made a fortune off the same basic concept.
So it's not enough to just have the idea. You got to know how to capitalize on it.
Right, and he contrasts that with Ray Kroc and McDonald's. It wasn't about the burgers themselves, it was the system, the execution, the consistency that made them so successful.
It's about having a solid model and sticking to it.
Yeah. And he warns against being too proud to learn from others, even if it means admitting you were wrong. He uses Apple as an example. Steve Jobs initially resisted licensing their operating system, and it almost killed the company.
So sometimes you got to swallow your pride and copy what works.
Yeah. Then he gets into the whole world of finance. He talks about how there's actually tons of money out there looking for investments, but it's really hard to get smaller amounts. Like, he needed $20 million, and he kept getting offered $100 million.
Wow, talk about a good problem to have. But I guess it comes with strings attached.
Oh, yeah. He says a lot of those investors want a big chunk of your company in return.
Makes sense. They want a big return on their investment.
He calls these guys the sharks and dolphins, the ones who are always circling. And then he talks about bootstrapping being a fish who funds their own growth.
It's the slower route, but you keep more control, right?
Exactly. He says it's a longer, harder path, but it can lead to more wealth and more happiness in the long run.
Interesting. Most people wouldn't associate asking for money with happiness.
Right. But he's saying that dependence on investors can create all kinds of pressure.
So it's about freedom, too.
Yeah, the freedom to make your own decisions, even if it takes longer to see the payoff. And he talks about how important it is to be resilient, to never give up, even when things get tough.
He even compares it to, like, the struggles of artists like Van Gogh.
Yeah, who, never really got recognition during his lifetime, but kept painting anyway. It's about that inner drive.
A belief in yourself.
Exactly. Now, he dedicates a whole chunk of the book to mistakes that startups make. Like, number one, thinking you should be passionate about something instead of actually feeling it in your gut.
Chasing what you think you should want instead of what truly excites you.
He's saying that's a recipe for disaster. You won't have the energy to push through the tough times if you're not truly invested.
Right. It's like forcing yourself to enjoy broccoli just because it's good for you.
Haha, perfect analogy. Then he talks about being overly optimistic about cash flow. The money coming in and going out.
That's the lifeblood of any business.
He calls it the heartbeat of your company. And he warns against relying on things like factoring, which can give you quick cash, but cost you a lot in the long run.
It's like a payday loan for businesses.
Exactly. And then there's this thing he calls reinforcing failure, basically. Throwing good money after bad on a project that's clearly not working.
Yeah, the sunk cost fallacy. We've all been there.
He admits he did it himself with Blender magazine, and it was a painful lesson. You gotta know when to cut your losses and move on.
Easier said than done, though.
Yeah.
It's hard to let go of something you've poured your heart into.
Yeah, it takes discipline. And another mistake he points out is thinking too big too early.
So, like getting ahead of yourself.
Yeah. He says you have to stay grounded, remember where you came from, and not lose sight of the details.
Don't forget the basics, even when you're growing fast.
Right. And finally, he says, never skimp on talent. Hiring the best people is crucial for success, even if it costs more upfront.
It's an investment.
Exactly. Good people will help you grow and innovate, which ultimately leads to more wealth.
So don't be afraid to spend money to make money.
Exactly. And he also talks about the power of self-belief. He says it's even more important than just being persistent. Like Winston Churchill, he never doubted he could beat the Nazis, even when things looked really bad.
It's about that unwavering conviction.
Yeah, and he even goes so far as to say getting rich is actually easier than some other human struggles, like battling addiction or overcoming trauma.
I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective. He's saying if you have that unshakable belief in yourself, you can achieve pretty much anything.
Inspiring, in a way.
And he's a fan of diversification. He uses Richard Branson as an example. You know how Branson has his fingers in all these different pies.
The Virgin Empire.
Exactly. He also says you got to always be learning, listening to others, even when you're at the top.
Never stop growing, right?
He gives some practical advice about running meetings, too. You know, having clear rules, making sure everyone knows who owns what ideas.
Sounds like common sense, but it's amazing how often that stuff gets overlooked.
Yeah. Then he dives into the whole luck thing. He acknowledges it exists, but he's like, don't rely on it. He tells these stories about what he calls disguised luck, like bad things happening that turned out to be blessings in disguise.
It's about being open to the unexpected twists and turns.
Exactly. He says you gotta be prepared for when luck strikes, and then you gotta grab it with both hands.
So be ready for anything.
Yeah. Now, this is where he gets a little intense. He says to be successful in business, you gotta be a predator.
A predator.
Yeah, like not in a ruthless, unethical way, but you gotta have that drive, that hunger to go after what you want.
So be aggressive, but within the rules.
Exactly. He also talks a lot about negotiation. You know,
Right.
how to get what you want in a deal.
He uses a lot of animal analogies in this book. First fish and sharks, now predators.
Haha, yeah. So with negotiation, he says most of it is unnecessary. Save the big guns for when it really matters.
Pick your battles.
Exactly. And he has this whole thing about the balance of weakness. Like, sometimes being smaller actually gives you leverage.
Really? How so?
Well, he tells this story about how he was negotiating the sale of Personal Computer World, and he was up against these huge corporations. But because he was smaller, he was more flexible, more willing to walk away.
So he used their size against them.
Exactly. And he has this whole list of negotiation principles. Do your homework, get expert help, but stay in control. Don't be afraid to ask for more.
It sounds like he's been through a lot of negotiations.
Oh, yeah. He even says the other side isn't your friend. Be polite, but don't get sentimental.
That's cold-blooded.
And he's a huge, huge believer in ownership. Like, that's his whole mantra. Ownership, ownership, ownership.
He really hammers that home in the book, doesn't he?
Yeah, he tells this crazy story about firing his partners because they wanted him to give up more shares in his company. He was like, nope, this is mine.
Wow, that's hardcore.
He believes ownership gives you freedom, time, and the ability to focus on the business without answering to anyone.
Sounds like he learned that the hard way.
Yeah, he even talks about this Mexican shootout clause they had in their partnership agreement.
A Mexican shootout clause? What's that?
It's a way to force a buyout if the partners can't agree.
Sounds intense.
He also talks about the differences between running a private company versus a public one. Like, private companies can be more focused on long-term growth, whereas public companies are always under pressure from shareholders to make quick profits.
It's a different game altogether.
And he talks about the importance of delegating tasks, trusting your team to handle things, but not just abandoning them. He has this system where he's ultimately in control, but lets others do their jobs.
So finding that balance between control and giving people autonomy.
And he prefers to give bonuses rather than equity when his companies are sold.
Interesting.
He believes in rewarding people for their hard work, but keeping the ownership within a tight circle.
Makes sense from his perspective.
Yeah, and he's very clear, you got to be ruthless when dealing with competition.
Not afraid to play hardball.
He's all about winning. Then he gets into the reality of failure. He's like, look, it's gonna happen, so get used to it.
It's part of the process.
He even points out that failure can sometimes be a good thing. Like, if you have minority shareholders, they might be more willing to negotiate a fair price when things are going south.
So, turn a negative into a positive.
Exactly. And he emphasizes being honest with people when things go wrong. Like, own up to your mistakes and be transparent.
Integrity matters, even when you're losing.
Okay, now for the really juicy part. He talks about the downsides of actually being rich.
The stuff they don't tell you in those motivational seminars.
Right. He tells the story about a friend who basically treated his company's money like his own personal piggy bank
Right.
and ended up in huge trouble with the tax man.
Yeah, that's a cautionary tale.
And he talks about how even when you're rich, you still end up wasting a lot of time on things you don't want to do.
So much for freedom, huh?
Right. And he's adamant that money doesn't equal happiness. He even quotes this old philosopher, Francis Bacon, who said riches are like the baggage of virtue.
Baggage of virtue, that's a good one.
Yeah. And he talks about the paranoia, the loneliness, the pressure that comes with wealth.
So it's not all it's cracked up to be.
Not always. He even says it's hard to keep old friends when you're rich, and you have to be careful about who you let into your inner circle.
It's like everyone wants something from you.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He also advises against getting romantically involved with your staff.
Bad idea.
And he says it's crucial to have people around you who are willing to challenge your decisions, even if it makes things awkward.
People who will tell you the truth, even when it's not what you want to hear.
Exactly. And get this, his ultimate goal is to get rich and then give it all away.
Whoa, really?
Yeah, he wants to use his wealth to do good in the world.
That's actually pretty admirable. So it's not about hoarding money for him. It's about using it for a bigger purpose.
Exactly. In the end, he kind of admits that his advice might not be for everyone. He even quotes John Gall, who said that systems sometimes work against their own goals.
So take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, I think so. He's basically saying, this is my experience. Take from it what you will, but don't blindly follow any system, even mine.
It's about finding your own path.
He also emphasizes that human nature is still human nature, no matter how much technology changes things.
People are still people.
He encourages listeners to visit his website. Always good for an author to plug their work, right? And he ends with this great quote from Benjamin Jowett. Never retreat, never explain, get it done and let them howl.
Haha. Love that. It's like just do your thing and don't worry about the haters.
Exactly. And he kind of circles back to his original intention for the book. He wanted to write an anti-self-help book, something that shows how hard it really is to get rich.
So no easy answers, no magic formulas.
Nope. Just hard work, smart decisions, a bit of luck, and a whole lot of resilience.
Sounds about right.
So that was Felix Dennis's How to Get Rich. Yeah, it's a pretty wild ride, right? Full of blunt truths, personal stories, and a whole lot of thinking outside the box.
Yeah, it's not your typical success story.
And for you listening, what's your takeaway? What does enough look like to you? And what are you willing to sacrifice or not to achieve it?
Big questions to ponder.
Definitely. We highly recommend checking out the book for yourself and seeing what resonates with you.
Lots to unpack there.
And thanks for sharing this with us. It's been a fascinating deep dive.
Absolutely.
We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.
See you then.
Bye for now.